about potential new tariffs on imported cars and parts.
Yeah, they were definitely making noise.
But let's try and cut through that. What does this really mean for you, for our listeners, even if maybe a new ride isn't on your radar right now?
Right.
We're talking potential price hikes on new cars. Could be anywhere from, what, $5,000 maybe? Upwards of $12,000?
That's what some estimates were suggesting, yeah. Big numbers.
And get this, even your insurance premiums, they could jump by as much as 10%. So what's the deal? Let's unpack this right now.
Well, it's important to understand this wasn't just, idle chatter back then.
Yeah.
President Trump had actually proposed slapping a 25% tariff on imported cars and also car components.
Right. The parts, too.
Exactly. And the stated goal was boosting U.S. auto manufacturing. Some of these tariffs were actually, teed up to take effect.
So it was serious.
Oh, yeah. The industry was definitely bracing for some real change.
Okay, exactly. So to try and get a clear picture of what the fallout could be, we've done a deep dive into a whole bunch of different sources. We've got insights from Yahoo Finance. They had an interview with the experts at cars.com. That gives us a look at how consumers were reacting, what the market was doing.
That immediate reaction is always telling.
Totally. We also dug into a global news article. That one explored how these tariffs could impact current car owners, which is, all of us who aren't necessarily shopping for a new vehicle right now.
Yeah, the knock-on effects.
Plus, we watched segments from Bloomberg Television and DW News on YouTube. They were breaking down the sort of broader economic consequences, the international response.
Bigger picture.
Exactly. And then to get a really global perspective, we even looked at news articles from 24 Kanal in Ukraine, Radio RSI, which covers Slovakia, and NV.ua, also from Ukraine.
So a wide range of viewpoints there. And I think pulling all of that together, our mission here is really to distill the crucial information, understand the likely domino effect of these potential tariffs.
Right.
We want to give you, the listener, a clear understanding of what it could mean for, the price tags on cars, the auto industry as a whole, and crucially, the money coming out of your pocket as a car owner.
Okay, so let's kick things off with those immediate concerns, the folks actually in the market for a new car. It sounds like things got a little crazy right after this tariff idea started gaining traction, didn't they?
Oh, it did, yeah. The immediate consumer reaction was quite telling. Cars.com reported a jaw-dropping 2,600% surge in online searches for cars made outside the U.S.
2,600%, wow.
Yeah, in the days right after the tariff announcement. That kind of spike really highlights how quickly folks got worried about potential price increases and, started looking for ways to maybe dodge them.
That's an incredible jump. And it turns out, according to our sources, there wasn't really any escaping these tariffs entirely, was there?
No, not really.
Even if you were planning on buying a vehicle assembled right here in the good old USA, chances are it's packed with parts that were shipped in from somewhere else.
That's such a key point. You really can't overstate it. The modern auto industry operates on this truly global scale,
Right.
Virtually every single vehicle, doesn't matter where it's finally put together, it relies on this complex web of international suppliers for its components.
So it doesn't matter if it's imported or U.S. assembled.
Pretty much. So whether you were eyeing a fully imported model or something rolling off an American assembly line, tariffs on those imported parts were poised to have a really widespread effect.
And the estimates on just how big that price hike could be, like you said, they were kind of all over the map, which I guess just shows how much uncertainty there was back then.
Totally.
We saw Wedbush throwing out $5,000 to $10,000 range. But then you had the automakers themselves hinting at anything from maybe $3,000 up to a staggering $12,000.
Yeah, that wide range really underscores the level of apprehension and just plain uncertainty within the industry itself.
Right.
The Anderson Economic Group, they offered some more specific figures. They suggested around a $4,000 increase for your typical crossover SUV.
Okay, that's still a lot.
It is, but potentially as much as a $12,000 jump for some electric vehicles.
Wow, $12,000.
Either way, yeah, we're talking about a serious chunk of change.
No kidding. And it sounds like the manufacturers were maybe brainstorming some interesting ways to handle this, like maybe spreading the cost increases across their entire model range.
That seemed to be one strategy being floated, yeah.
So they wouldn't shock buyers with massive price tags on their bread and butter models, like the Chevy Silverado, which, as we learned, is actually assembled mostly in Mexico and Canada.
Exactly. That's a strategic move that kind of makes sense from their perspective.
Yeah.
Rather than hitting a few key models with these huge price hikes, smaller increases across the board could be a way to sort of soften the blow for consumers, maybe maintain overall sales volume.
A balancing act.
It's a really delicate balancing act for them, yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to absorb some of the added costs while still staying competitive in the market.
Now, here's a heads up from the folks at cars.com that I thought was particularly interesting. They said if you happen to be at a dealership right now and they're trying to tack on some mysterious tariff fee, that's likely bogus, or at least it was at that point in time. No official price changes had actually been announced by the automakers themselves yet.
Ah, okay. Good to know.
Yeah. Their advice was pretty straightforward. If you were serious about buying, you might want to, pull the trigger sooner rather than later because of all this expected price volatility.
That's a really practical tip for anyone who is in the market then. In situations like that where future pricing is uncertain because of potential policy shifts, acting sooner could indeed save you money before any actual tariff-related cost increases trickle down to the dealership level, if they ever did.
Okay, so that's the potential headache for new car buyers. But what about the rest of us, the folks who already have a car sitting in the driveway? Were we in the clear? Sounds like maybe not so much.
Well, this brings up a really important question, doesn't it? How do these tariffs potentially affect current car owners?
Right.
And our sources indicate that even if you weren't planning on trading your vehicle anytime soon, you could still feel the pinch.
Where?
In a couple of key areas, it seems. Your auto insurance premiums and the cost of getting your car repaired.
Right, insurance. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce actually put out a prediction saying that tariffs on cars, but also on raw materials like steel and aluminum,
inputs,
would likely lead to higher insurance premiums. And when you stop and think about it, that makes a certain kind of sense, I guess.
It does. Rates.ca, which is an insurance comparison website up in Canada, they dug a little deeper. They explained that the physical damage portion of your insurance premium.
Okay.
The part that covers things like collisions, theft, vandalism, stuff like that.
Right, comp and collision.
Exactly. That typically makes up about a quarter of your overall premium. And this is the part that's most likely to see an increase.
Why? Just because parts cost more?
Precisely.
No.
Because the cost of fixing vehicles will go up if the price of parts gets inflated due to these tariffs.
And we're not talking about pocket change here, are we? Rates.ca was estimating potential increases in the range of, 3 to 8%?
That was their estimate, yeah.
But the C.D. Howe Institute, another Canadian think tank, was even suggesting we could see jumps of 5 to 10%, or possibly even higher, just because of all the economic uncertainty these tariffs were creating.
Yeah, those are potentially significant increases. That kind of hike would hit just about every car owner in the wallet,
Doesn't matter if it's domestic or imported.
Doesn't matter. Simply because the fundamental cost of repairing vehicles is expected to rise across the board.
And speaking of repairs, it's not just the insurance companies that would be feeling this, right? If the price of those imported parts goes up, it's pretty logical to assume that the bill when you take your car to the mechanic is also going to increase.
Seemed almost certain.
Although one thing that was mentioned was some uncertainty about whether this would also lead to higher labor costs for the mechanics themselves.
That's a fair point. While the cost of the parts themselves seems almost certain to increase if tariffs are implemented, the knock-on effect on labor costs is a bit less clear. It could depend on broader economic conditions, whether mechanics might seek higher wages to offset any potential increase in their own living expenses.
Yeah.
Maybe due to inflation sparked by the tariffs.
Right, the ripple effect. So it sounds like no matter which way you slice it, whether you're buying new or just keeping your current vehicle running, these tariffs had the potential to make things more expensive for pretty much all of us.
That seems to be the consensus from the sources, yeah.
Okay, so let's pull back now and look at the bigger picture here. The wider auto industry and the economy as a whole. It sounds like this isn't as simple as just flipping a switch and bringing all the manufacturing back to the U.S., is it?
Absolutely not. What becomes really clear when you look at the auto industry today is just how incredibly complex and, interconnected it is globally.
Yeah.
Like Aaron Bragman from Cars.com pointed out, you can't just uproot production and supply chains overnight. It's just not feasible.
Takes time, money.
Exactly. It's a process that takes years and requires billions, literally billions of dollars in investment. You're essentially unwinding decades of building these really efficient global networks. Now, individual plants might have some limited flexibility, maybe shift production between different models,
Okay.
but fundamentally changing where parts are sourced and where vehicles are assembled, that's a monumental undertaking.
We even heard that some automakers were trying to, like, hoard parts, build up their inventory ahead of these potential tariffs.
They were. It's like they saw the economic storm clouds gathering on the horizon.
Trying to ride it out.
It's a natural reaction for businesses, right? Trying to mitigate the immediate impact of anticipated cost increases. However, as our sources emphasized, stockpiling parts can only provide, a temporary buffer.
Right, you can't hoard forever.
You really can't hoard your way out of the long-term implications of significant tariffs like these.
And the deep integration of the North American auto industry, particularly with Mexico, really jumped out at me. It sounds like a huge amount of production has shifted south of the border over the years, mostly because of lower operating costs.
That's absolutely right. The Bloomberg television segment we looked at really highlighted the extent to which auto manufacturing has migrated to Mexico, especially over the past decade or so.
Why there?
Primarily driven by more competitive labor costs. And this deep level of integration means that tariffs don't just affect, say, fully imported vehicles from Europe or Asia. They create these ripple effects throughout the entire North American automotive supply chain. Canada, US, Mexico, it's all linked.
Ford CEO certainly didn't sound too enthusiastic about the whole idea back then. He was quoted saying that these tariffs would blow a hole in the American auto industry.
Yeah, that's pretty strong language.
Especially when you consider the stated goal was actually to help the industry.
That statement from a major industry leader like Ford's CEO really underscores the potential for, unintended negative consequences.
Right.
Even companies with a significant manufacturing footprint right here in the U.S. recognized that these tariffs could actually be detrimental. They could lead to increased costs for them and potentially weaken their competitive position globally.
And this whole idea of an all-American car, it seems to be more of a nostalgic myth than a current reality, doesn't it?
It really is. Even the big U.S. automakers, Ford, GM, they rely heavily on parts sourced from all around the globe. One of our Ukrainian sources, NV.UA, pointed out that Mexico alone supplies over 40% of the imported auto parts that come into the United States.
40% just from Mexico.
Just from Mexico. So that's a crucial piece of the puzzle that often gets lost in the discussion, The concept of a truly domestic vehicle is largely an illusion in today's interconnected world.
So tariffs on imported components would inevitably drive up costs for U.S.-based manufacturers, too.
Absolutely. No escaping it.
Okay. Looking beyond North America, then, it sounds like the impact of these tariffs would have been felt, globally.
Oh, for sure.
One of our sources from Ukraine, 24 Canal, even predicted a potential, get this, 30% reduction in global car production.
30%? That's huge.
Yeah. And significant economic losses for major car exporting countries. Japan, South Korea, Germany, Mexico.
Yeah.
That's a potentially massive disruption to the entire global economy, not just cars.
That's a really stark prediction. It highlights the potential for just widespread negative consequences on international trade and manufacturing within the automotive sector. It wouldn't just stay in that sector either.
And European car makers were already feeling the pressure, weren't they? Just from the threat of these tariffs.
They were. We heard about billions, literally billions of dollars in market capitalization just being wiped out for giants like Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Porsche, Continental, the parts supplier.
Just from the talk.
Just from the talk, the uncertainty. For example, Mercedes-Benz exports its popular S-Class sedans from Germany to the U.S.
Right.
A 25% tariff would have made those cars significantly more expensive and, frankly, much less competitive in the American market.
Yeah, you're adding a huge chunk to the price tag.
The DW News report really emphasized the direct vulnerability of German manufacturers, given their substantial export volumes to the United States. The potential hit to Mercedes-Benz's operating earnings alone was estimated to be quite significant.
Just to be clear for listeners, market capitalization is basically the total stock market value of a company, right?
Exactly. It's the total value of all their outstanding shares. So big drops mean investors were getting nervous.
And the European Union, they weren't just going to stand by and take this, were they?
No, didn't sound like it.
They were threatening to retaliate with their own tariffs, weren't they? Even though they had previously been trying to negotiate some kind of solution with the U.S.
That's a critical dynamic in any potential trade conflict like this. As DW News pointed out, the EU had previously shown, a willingness to engage in negotiations. They'd even temporarily held off on some retaliatory measures they had planned on other issues.
Trying to keep things calm.
Exactly. But the prospect of these auto tariffs likely shifted that stance quite dramatically. It significantly raised the risk of a full-blown trade war.
And economists and global leaders, they seemed pretty united in their concern about this whole thing, characterizing these tariffs as basically a tax on consumers.
Yeah, that phrase came up a lot.
And that it could fuel inflation and damage the broader global economy.
The overwhelming consensus among economists, as reflected in pretty much all their sources, was that these tariffs would ultimately be passed on to consumers, you and me.
In the form of higher prices.
In the form of higher prices. The widespread fear was that this would contribute to rising inflation and slow down overall global economic growth.
And what about President Trump's assertion back then of potentially trillions of dollars in tariff revenue coming into the U.S.? Did that hold water?
Well, it sounds like that might have been a rather optimistic forecast.
You think?
One of the experts interviewed by DW News pointed out that historically, U.S. tariff revenue was nowhere near that level. Not even close.
Okay.
And just basic economics, really, higher prices could actually lead to a decrease in imports, right? People buy less expensive stuff.
Which would undermine the revenue projections.
Exactly. It would undermine those lofty revenue projections. It's a key point of economic reality. When tariffs increase the cost of imported goods, consumers and businesses often choose to buy less of those goods. That leads to a reduction in import volumes.
And less tariff revenue collected.
Precisely.
Some of the analysis we saw went even further, didn't it? Labeling these tariffs as economic self-harm or even economic warfare, suggesting they'd drive up prices without necessarily bringing back a significant number of jobs.
Right.
And would carry the real risk of escalating international trade disputes.
Yeah, those are strong terms, but they really underscore the potential for negative and unintended consequences that many experts foresaw. Higher prices for consumers, higher prices for businesses using imported components.
Disruptions everywhere.
Disruptions to established supply chains that took decades to build, and the very real possibility of retaliatory measures from other countries that could harm numerous sectors way beyond just the automotive industry.
And it was interesting, too, hearing the perspective that maybe long-term trends like automation and robotics in manufacturing might actually have a much bigger impact on jobs in the long run than tariffs ever could.
That's a really important forward-looking point, I think. The DW News segment raised that possibility that the ongoing advancements in automation, in robotics within manufacturing, they can be far more significant drivers of shifts in employment, both gains and losses, than imposing tariffs.
Right. And there was also a fair amount of skepticism about whether these tariffs would actually lead to a net increase in jobs overall.
Yeah, that was definitely questioned.
Especially if they ended up damaging the overall health of the economy, right?
Exactly. I mean, if tariffs lead to decreased consumer demand because things cost more, and that leads to subsequent production cuts across various industries, the net effect on job creation could very well be negative, even possibly in the sectors like auto manufacturing that the tariffs were supposedly intended to protect.
Our source out of Ukraine, envy.ua, they really highlighted the vulnerability of major manufacturers like Ford and GM because of their deeply integrated supply chains with Canada and Mexico.
That connection again.
They even pointed out again that popular models like the Chevrolet Silverado are primarily assembled outside of the United States.
Right. Not many people realize that.
And even the vehicles assembled here rely on a significant number of imported parts. There's just no getting around it.
It really just reinforces that central point, doesn't it, about the interconnectedness of the modern auto industry. Even iconic American vehicle models rely on these intricate cross-border supply chains. That makes them inherently susceptible to tariffs on imported components.
Envy.ua also provided an estimate, another number here, that these tariffs could potentially increase the cost of a car by over $10,000.
Over 10 grand, yeah.
I mean, that kind of price hike could definitely lead to a drop in demand, couldn't it? Which in turn could force production cuts and, yes, potentially result in job losses within the auto industry itself.
Absolutely. That's a substantial potential increase that could have this cascading effect throughout the entire automotive sector. It impacts everything from initial production levels to final sales figures and ultimately overall employment within the industry.
And there were concerns raised, too, in our sources about the kind of the long-term competitiveness of the U.S. auto industry, with some experts fearing that these policies could actually end up harming its ability to compete effectively on the global stage down the road.
Yeah, the worry there is that by artificially increasing costs within the U.S. and potentially triggering these damaging trade disputes with other nations, these tariffs could actually undermine the long-term ability of the U.S. auto industry to innovate, to invest, and to compete successfully in the international marketplace. It could backfire.
Finally, our source from Slovakia, Radio RSI, they emphasized how maintaining strong trade relationships, specifically between the European Union and the United States, ultimately benefits consumers on both sides of the Atlantic. Pretty straightforward idea.
Seems logical.
They pointed out that trade wars, kind of obviously, can lead to reduced economic growth and even carry the risk of recession. Interestingly, they also suggested that the EU might actually be more vulnerable to the negative effects of a trade war.
More vulnerable than the U.S. Why?
Because of its higher ratio of exports to its overall GDP, they rely more on selling stuff abroad.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
That international perspective really underscores the broader macroeconomic risks associated with these kinds of protectionist trade policies.
Yeah.
It highlights the fact that, it's usually not just one side that suffers in a trade dispute.
Yeah.
Both sides involved can experience negative consequences, potentially leading to slower economic growth for everyone.
Right.
And they also made a really noteworthy point about the interconnectedness of various sectors beyond just automotive.
Yeah.
Things like pharmaceuticals, metalworking, aerospace, shipping.
All potentially hit by tariffs.
All potentially impacted by tariffs and retaliatory tariffs. And Slovakia's own potential vulnerability, which they discussed. Even though its direct exports to the U.S. might be relatively small, its strong links with the German automotive industry, supplying parts to them.
Ah, the indirect effect.
Exactly. That really illustrates just how far-reaching the effects of such policies can be. It's like dropping a stone in a pond.
Okay, so, wow. To try and wrap it all up then, it sounds like these potential tariffs could have unleashed, well, a whole host of problems.
Seems that way.
We're talking significantly higher prices for anyone buying a new car.
Check.
Increased insurance premiums and probably repair bills for those of us who already own a vehicle.
Let's check again.
Major disruptions to the incredibly complex global auto industry supply chain.
Definitely.
And some pretty serious broader economic concerns about rising inflation and the potential for nasty international trade wars.
Precisely. I think the key takeaway here from looking at all these different angles is that these potential tariffs were far from just an isolated issue affecting one product.
Right.
They really had the potential to create this wide-ranging ripple effect, impacting consumers, the entire automotive industry, and frankly, the global economy in a multitude of interconnected ways.
So as you, our listener, think about maybe your next car purchase, or maybe just that next insurance bill that lands in your mailbox, or even just the overall health of the economy, how will these potential shifts, these kinds of policy ideas, influence your decisions and your expectations going forward? Were these tariffs, in theory, a necessary step towards strengthening domestic industry, or were they more of a high-stakes gamble with potentially significant costs for both consumers, businesses, and the global economy?
It's a big question.
It is. It's certainly something to keep in mind as we all navigate the roads ahead.